Good morning, class. Today we're going to be covering a very important concept in the field of microeconomics, and that is the inner working of supply and demand. Supply and demand are important for both producers and consumers to understand. Producers can use supply and demand to figure out what price to charge for their goods and how much of their product will likely sell at any given price. Consumers can use supply and demand to track prices over time and make smarter purchasing decisions. To start off today, I'd like to go over a couple of vocabulary words with you, just so you hear them and get the definitions, know what they mean, and be able to follow along in today's lecture. The first pair of terms I'd like to go over with you are pretty basic ones you should already know. I just talked about them briefly, are producer and consumer. Like I said, these are important to know when studying supply and demand because they both have a direct effect on what the supply and demand curves will look like. The next pair of terms I want to go over are the ones that we're talking about here today, supply and demand. Supply is how much of a product a market can provide. In other words, how much of a good is produced and available for the purchase. Demand, on the other hand, is how much of a product is desired by consumers. How much will consumers buy of that product? And just after hearing that, we can kind of see how supply and demand relate to each other. It is important for producers to understand demand because producers want to maximize their profits. So in theory, this would mean that a company would produce as much of their good as possible and charge the highest price possible, so that there'd be a lot of their good in the market and it would be a high price, so they'd make a lot of profit per unit. But this creates an obvious problem. Say Pepsi decide to charge $3.75 for a bottle. What are some options that you could do instead of continue to pay for Pepsi at a higher price? You could have RC Cola, you could get Faygo, right? In this instance, RC and Faygo would be called substitute goods. That's another term I want you guys to know. Substitute goods are just goods that are like what you're trying to avoid buying. They're similar, maybe not the same thing, but usually you buy substitute goods to lower your costs. But realistically, Pepsi wouldn't charge $3.75 for a bottle. They wouldn't sell any because there are a lot of substitute goods out there. So producers and consumers need to find a healthy balance. The next term, equilibrium, is that healthy balance. Equilibrium is the point where supply and demand meet. In other words, it's where supply equals demand. Producers are selling exact quantity that the consumers are buying, and the economy is said to be working at maximum efficiency when is at equilibrium. I know these terms are kind of getting to be a little much, but I think they'll make sense when you see them on the graph. And this is supposed to be drawing on the board, but I don't have a board. Okay, this graph shows a demand curve for gasoline. The y-axis is price per liter. X-axis is liters purchased per week. Right off the bat, you can see the demand curve in red is sloping downwards from left to right. This tells us that there's an inverse relationship between the price per liter and the liters purchased per week. An inverse relationship means that as one quantity either or goes up, the other one will go down. So as you can see, when the gas company charges $2 for 1 liter, only 50 people will buy it. And that's compared to if they charge $1, 120 people will buy it per week. 120 liters sold per week. So you can see how as the price per liter drops, the demand goes up. The next graph I want to show you is a supply curve. The supply curve, you can see, slopes upwards from left to right, which tells us that the data have direct relationship with each other. This means as the price per liter or the liters per week go up, the other quantity will go up with it. Um, and the direct relationship on supply curves goes back to what I was saying earlier about the companies wanting to maximize their profits. If the price of gasoline goes up, they're going to produce more of it in order to sell as much as they can at the highest price. But if the company was able to charge what they wanted at the highest price, and the consumer wants to lower its costs as much as possible, that creates an obvious problem. Just as producers want to maximize profits, consumers want to minimize costs. If producers set the price too high, less people will buy their good. And if people will either look for substitute goods or just go without. So now what we need to do is we need to find the equilibrium that I was talking about earlier. So I took the graphs of the supply and demand curves that we just looked at and put them together. And as I said, the equilibrium price is the point where these lines cross, which on this graph happens to be at $1.50 at 75 liters per week. The balance between the supply and demand is the equilibrium. The equilibrium price is the highest price that the company can charge while still selling the highest amount of liters per week. So, for example, the gas company might make more per liter at a higher price, or they might sell more liters at a lower price. But charging at this current level of supply and demand, charging anything other than $1.50 per liter would not be economically efficient. Supply and demand are not set values, but rather they can shift. Now there are many factors that can go into shifting demand or supply. Some of the factors that can go into shifting demand are consumer income, consumer preferences, price and availability of substitute goods, or population. For example, if you get a raise, the consumer's income increases, which gives you more disposable income to spend on other goods. Consumer preference, let's say you tried a new product and it's the best thing, it's your favorite of that kind of product, your preference would shift towards that product, which would increase the demand. A shift in price, if the price dropped, the demand would go up. If the price raised, demand would drop. And population, if there's a dramatic shift in population over time, then the demand for goods in that area would change to reflect that. In terms of supply shifts can result from changes in production costs, improvements in technology that make production easier, or industry growth and shrinkage. So now we'll look at what it looks like when a demand curve shifts. This one in red right here is the first demand curve, and you can see something happened, whether it be a drop in population or a change in price or what have you, but something happened to move the demand curve over here. And when the demand curve shifts, that affects the equilibrium price. And so what I did was I just took the two demand curves we just looked at and put the supply curve from earlier over top of it. And we can see that the original equilibrium price up here has now shifted down here to meet the new demand curve with the old supply curve. And so now the equilibrium price has dropped because the demand has dropped. And then you can kind of see how this would affect production and things like that. So now I'm going to hand out a practice worksheet where you can practice plotting supply and demand graphs and practice plotting shifts and see how equilibrium shifts along the lines on your own. So work on those.